I've noticed a common response to panpsychism is some variation of, show me the evidence. If you make a factual claim, you must provide empirical evidence. But the problem of consciousness is unlike other problems, because consciousness is unobservable, and not for the same reason that other postulates, like electrons, are unobservable. And we'll get to that later. But the bottom line is that we can't straightforwardly test theories of consciousness, including materialism. We can't distinguish between materialism and panpsychism with experiment or with empirical observation. Materialism and panpsychism are empirically equivalent. So if someone is demanding that I show them the evidence, it's a burden that I can't meet, but neither can the materialist, because consciousness is unobservable. And by consciousness, I just mean the fact that it's like something to be. This is Thomas Nagel's famous definition, and I think that it's what makes the mind-body problem interesting. As Nagel says, most theories of consciousness don't even try to explain consciousness. They just leave this part out. When I was speaking with Aaron Rabinowitz on the Right to Reason podcast, I remember Aaron using the phrase purely theoretical concerns, as in it seems ridiculous to accept this radical view of consciousness when such a view is motivated by purely theoretical concerns. Panpsychism is driven by purely theoretical concerns, but there couldn't be any other kind of concern, and the same goes for materialism. Materialism is driven by purely theoretical concerns. There is no empirical data, no observation you can point to, that will give materialism an edge over panpsychism, or vice versa. Materialism is not a scientific theory. It's not a scientific fact. It's a metaphysical interpretation of scientific facts. And I want to emphasize that panpsychism and materialism both evoke very different connotations, but as ideas, they're extremely similar. I often say panpsychism is just modified materialism. And I'll also say that panpsychism is a lot less radical than you probably think it is. The more I engage on this subject, the more I realize that opponents of panpsychism think that panpsychists are saying a lot more than we're actually saying. But why switch from the more cautious, default state of materialism to this new, weird view that's technically hard to argue against? The thing is, materialism is the default view as a result of our theory of mind, our evolved psychological module that helps us navigate the social landscape and avoid predators. It can misfire in false negatives and false positives. It's far from perfect. When I say theory of mind, I'm talking about your ability to attribute states of consciousness to chunks of matter out there in the world. And the less human-shaped they are, the usefulness of your theory of mind diminishes. And as I mentioned, it's subject to false positives and false negatives. Sometimes you hear a noise and you think that it's a person, an agent, when really it's just the wind. There are also false negatives. If someone is sufficiently camouflaged, for example, you can walk right by them. The point being, you can't trust your intuitions when you're attributing states of consciousness to things out in the world. And I believe our theory of mind is the only reason materialism is the default view. It's not because of some well-thought-out argument. It's not because we observe matter to be non-conscious. Materialism doesn't have an empirical edge over panpsychism, and I would argue it doesn't have a rational edge either. And panpsychists haven't changed the rules to make this the case. This is based on considerations of simplicity, parsimony, theoretical economy, and a few relatively uncontroversial premises, like monism, non-emergence, realism about consciousness. These are views that are commonly held by materialists. On panpsychism, we're continuous with physical matter, just like we recently found out that we're continuous with biological organisms. I see panpsychism as the next rational step in the Copernican arc of history of realizing that humans are less special. We're not fundamentally different from other physical matter. We're continuous with the physical world, just like we're continuous with biological organisms. To all the people who are demanding evidence for panpsychism, I would say, what's the evidence for non-conscious matter? We don't know non-conscious matter exists. The only thing we know for sure is that conscious matter exists. So why emergence? If we accept radical emergence, It means there's conscious matter and non-conscious matter. I don't like this because I want to be a monist. So there are three options here. One is that consciousness didn't emerge. No human beings are conscious. The second, a miracle occurs. Conscious matter emerges from non-conscious matter. The third option is that consciousness didn't emerge, and we're continuous with all physical matter. Emergence is theoretically expensive. There's no logical problem with strong emergence, but it's a miracle, and it's arguably non-monistic. So if you believe that matter is fundamentally non-conscious, then you believe in two types of matter, and yet still want to call yourself a monist, and you believe in radical emergence. So panpsychism and materialism are empirically equivalent, but panpsychism has the edge on grounds of simplicity and theoretical economy. Let's return to that point we started with, the show me the evidence response that materialists have offered up again and again. I mentioned that materialism and panpsychism were empirically equivalent, and that theoretical concerns, like simplicity, are the only things that could sway us to one or the other. Materialism is not the rational default here. It doesn't have any rational or empirical edge. Consciousness is unobservable from a third-person perspective. You haven't observed non-conscious matter, and you've never observed consciousness. You can obviously observe your own consciousness, but that's not what I mean. I mean, you can't observe consciousness no matter what instruments you have. There's no consciousness microscope. So let's talk about something else that's unobservable: electrons. They are also unobservable, but for a different reason. Take two essential traits of electrons: mass and charge. Mass is observable in principle. It can be measured. Same goes for electric charge. But what about conscious experience? Can it be measured from the third-person perspective in the same way mass and charge can be measured? Think about the fact that you will never know that someone else is conscious. You know that you're conscious because you're directly acquainted with your own conscious experience, but will you ever know that someone else is conscious with the same degree of certainty that you know that you're conscious? Well, no, you can't. And this is the kind of radical skepticism that can lead to solipsism. Solipsism is only possible because of this problem of other minds. Consciousness is the only thing that can't be an illusion, and yet it seems to be unlike all other physical things we know about in that it can't be observed or measured, even in principle. Philip Goff has pointed out that a big difference between electrons and consciousness is that electrons are postulated. We postulate unobservables to explain things we can observe. Consciousness is not like that. We're not postulating consciousness to explain something. In fact, if we were just going off of third-person observations, we wouldn't even know consciousness existed. We only know about consciousness because we're conscious. If we were observing from a third-person perspective, we would have no reason to postulate consciousness. So consciousness is the thing we're trying to explain here. It's not an unobservable that we're postulating to explain some data. Is there any fundamental incompatibility between mass and charge and experience? Is there any reason those things can't coexist? I don't see any reason. Why can't experience coexist with behavior? Two aspects of the same thing, with experience being the view from the inside and behavior being the view from the outside. And as an afterthought, I want to make an episode about this, but I'll just say that panpsychism is compatible with physics. It doesn't imply that physics is wrong, or that we need to change anything about physics. It doesn't imply that our observations of what particles are doing would be different. Panpsychism is also compatible with physicalism. It's a version of physicalism. In fact, one could argue that many versions of physicalism imply panpsychism. As I've been hammering on over and over again, consciousness is unobservable. The fact that it's like something to be cannot be viewed from the outside. The point being, consciousness is always inferred. It is never observed. So to say, show me the evidence, means that you haven't really internalized the fact that even though we know consciousness is real, you can't observe it from a third-person perspective. Again, materialism is not a scientific theory or a scientific fact. It's a metaphysical interpretation of scientific facts. It's only the default view because of our intuitions, which didn't evolve to help us detect consciousness everywhere it exists. It's not the default view because of any empirical edge, and it's not the default view because there's some great argument for materialism. It's not the simpler view, it's the view that's naturally produced by our cognitive faculties. That is, Descartes' view of matter, that we know that most non-human matter is non-conscious. But why would our intuitions serve as an infallible guide to the nature of matter? Thank you for listening. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll talk to you next time.